Mosaic, a daily news program from WorldLink TV, presents a selection of news reports from independent and state-controlled broadcasters from throughout the Middle East.
Welcome to the news of the hour from Abu Dhabi Television. A Palestinian boy was martyred following the Israeli shelling of Rafah in southern Gaza. Bush dismisses international efforts to peacefully disarm Iraq. Blair warns Iraq that it must fully comply with the UN resolutions and calls for international action to disarm Iraq. Blair also attacks the French and German authorities who support the inspections and asks that they won't use their veto power when voting on the new resolution. In the event of a war on Iraq, Turkey plans to allow the deployment of 62,000 American soldiers on its soil for 6 months, whereas the Turkish parliament is currently debating this issue. Now to our correspondent in Istanbul, Mohammed Al-Abbasi.
The minister signed a resolution to join the United States in its war on Iraq. However, the government refused to present the resolution to Parliament pending Washington's approval of Turkey's demands. Members of Parliament must reflect their constituencies' opinion in their vote.
Blix insists that Al-Samud 2 missiles be destroyed beginning on Saturday. Iraqi officials say the issue of their destruction is still under review. Our correspondent from Baghdad, Shakir Hamid.
Tariq Aziz asserted that Hans Blix's demands to destroy Al-Samud missiles is still under review. He added that Iraq is preparing for a difficult confrontation with the United States. Meanwhile, the United Nations inspectors intensified their inspections, whereas they visited 14 Iraqi sites, including those which contained Al-Samud missiles.
This is the end of the news in brief.
The Turkish parliament is currently debating the legislative plan, which would allow the deployment of American troops in northern Turkey. Turkey's government had approved the plan after the U.S. promised to offer military, political, and economic aid. Now to our correspondent from Istanbul, Mohammed Al-Abbasi.
The third American ship carrying military equipment entered the port of Iskenderun to unload its cargo. This comes after Turkey's government agreed to join the United States in its war against Iraq. The protesters who demonstrated in front of the parliament were not able to hinder this decision. Rather, they fell captive in the hands of the police. According to Prime Minister Abdullah Gül, currently there is no room for emotions, whereas the Milliyet newspaper wrote that interests over emotions is the slogan of Gül's government. Party leader Recep Tayyip Erdogan reiterated the same slogan to his parliament members. He believes that the government's decision serves the national interest since the current situation in the region is out of Turkey's hands. Erdogan added that once the decision is voted on in parliament, it will become legitimate. The parliament must carefully review the sensitive issue. Ultimately, this is the place which reflects most of the people's opinions. Erdogan's remarks contradict the decision to suspend Deputy Ruksal Koçak Ali pending investigation for his refusal to vote on the issue of allowing the United States to modernize their Turkish bases. These remarks were made by Deniz Bakyal, leader of the People's Republican Party, during his speech in the parliament. Muhammad Aghar, leader of the Right Path Party, also made similar remarks. What is the problem that our parliament is facing today? The problem is Parliament is trying not to detach Turkey from the world's conscience. We are trying not to detach our nation from its history and integrity. Minister Arkan Moho, Jamil Shekhek, Golded Ashket, Hussein Shalik, and Rajab Akhdar refused to sign the legislation authorizing war. However, the Prime Minister warnings of the possible creation of a Kurdish state in northern Iraq ultimately forced them to sign it. Nevertheless, Their names deserve to be added in the national honors list.
السباق إذن محموم
The race at the diplomatic front entered the last stage before a final decision regarding Iraq will be reached. The world is watching events play out at the United Nations Security Council, where rivals are racing against time to build alliances.
في هذا الطرف أو ذاك.
Two coalitions has entered into a diplomatic race. The first one is led by the United States and Britain, in addition to Spain, who joined them recently. The other one is led by France and Germany. Also, the race inside the European Union and the United Nations Security Council is intense, and it has several dimensions, though the race inside the United Nations Security Council is more intense because it is where international decisions are made. Meanwhile, the French and American coalitions are racing to enlist the Security Council members on their side. Last night, both coalitions has put their own proposals at the Council's table. The first proposal, which was submitted by the United States, Britain and Spain, calls for a second resolution with the objective of legitimizing the use of force. The second one was submitted by France with the objective of enforcing the inspection operations in Iraq. France renewed its opposition for a second resolution regarding to Iraq, describing it as useless. Germany and other non-permanent members in the Security Council supported the French position.
هناك دول بعينها تعتقد بأهمية صدور.
Some countries believe in the importance of a second resolution, yet we believe that that is not necessary. The inspection operations have not been completed. There is no need for a second resolution in addition to Resolution 1441.
في المقابل بدت
Washington and London reject the French position and insist on passing a second resolution in a short period of time. It appears that the end of this period will mark the 0 hour in their perspective.
Because we want to reach an international agreement and give Iraq time to completely cooperate, we will allow 2 to 3 weeks before we ask the UN to adopt the second resolution.
This period of time is not only intended for further negotiations to build a coalition in the Security Council, but also to push international opinion towards the war. In the next 2 weeks, there will be a lot of important dates regarding the Iraqi crisis. March 1st is the deadline for destroying Al-Samud 2 missiles, which is a very important issue in determining the level of the Iraqi cooperation with the inspectors. March 7th, Blix and Al-Barad'i will submit their second report to the United Nations Security Council regarding the weapons inspection operations, which began there months ago. On the 14th of March, the Security Council is scheduled to hold a meeting at the level of foreign ministers to evaluate the situation in the wake of Blix and Barad'i reports, in addition to the suggestions of the country members. Though Iraq has shown reluctance in responding to Blix's demand to destroy Al-Samud 2 missiles, it is trying hard to prove that it has good intentions in cooperating with the weapon inspectors. Blix himself has shed doubts on the sincerity of the Iraqi response and doubted that it would be sufficient to prove that Baghdad is cooperating fully. In addition, he described the Iraqi government as a government with no credibility and prepared a list of 30 questions for it. This list may become a new justification for launching the war if Baghdad fails Blix's test, which was prepared in an American style. Meanwhile, Washington is getting closer in resolving the last obstacle that prevented it from deploying its troops along the Turkish border. The Turkish government demanded the parliament to give the Americans a green light to do so. Washington needs to resolve this obstacle quickly if it wants to start the war after the 15th of March.
ومعنا مباشرة من القاهرة دكتور مصطفى اللباد.
From Cairo, we have with us the chief editor of Sharq al-Nama magazine, Dr. Mustafa Labada.
نبحث معهم في التطورات الأخيرة وفي السيناريوهات المحتملة.
We will continue talking about the Iraqi crisis, hoping to figure out the possible scenarios in the next few days.
يعني خلال ال 20 دقيقة القادمة سيقدم.
What are the probabilities of passing the American resolution, especially considering that France may veto it?
الفرنسي قد يظهر إلى السطح.
We need to explain the French position and the motives behind it.
يعني أبين حقيقة الموقف البريطاني.
First, let me speak about the British position.
إلى آخر المدى والمحللين ووسائل الإعلام.
Although Britain may look like it is supporting the U.S. unconditionally, as many observers would like us to believe, but I do not believe so.
نفط العراق وشركة بريتش بتروليوم أكبر شركات.
Britain has its own national interests in the Iraqi oil. British Petroleum is the largest oil company in Britain and the world. It wants to get a big piece of the Iraqi oil pie.
باقتسام حصة نفط العراق وبالتالي تمشي.
England got guarantees in obtaining shares of the Iraqi oil, and that is why it goes the extra mile in supporting the United States.
إلى حد كبير بمصالحها الوطنية.
The French position is different. Though France is viewed as a hero by Arabs, it still has its national interests.
أصبحت مثلا زعيمة الشارع العربي كما يعني قيل في وسائل الإعلام.
France does not want to end up empty-handed. In recent weeks, Chirac's position has fluctuated. Sometimes he says that he will use the veto, and in other times he says that he will reconsider and that the use of force must have conditions. Thus, if the Total Oil Company, which is the largest French oil company, manages to get a reasonable share of the Iraqi oil, France will reverse its position. It may not support the proposed United States resolution, but it may abstain from using its veto right. The German position is different.
طيب ولكن قبل الحديث عن الوضع في ألمانيا ولكن هناك من يقول.
Before we speak about Germany, if oil interests motivate France, what guarantees does it have in the long run? The interests you mentioned are short-term interests.
The 20th century was the oil century.
يعني إذا استعرضنا في عجالة سريعة تاريخ القرن العشرين.
The Sykes-Picot Agreement, which divided the Middle East region, was motivated by oil.
توخت بريطانيا أن تحتفظ لنفسها بالمناطق التي تحتوي على النفط ومنها العراق.
Britain kept rich oil regions for itself, including Iraq and the Gulf, while France was left with Syria and Lebanon, which doesn't have any oil.
وبالتالي كان هذا الملمح الأول. الملمح الثاني الحرب العالمية الثانية.
Also, the Second World War was motivated by oil.
أحد دوافعها وفي أحد وجوهها من أجل النفط. يعني ألمانيا.
Germany wanted to invade the Soviet Union because it wanted to control the oil of Azerbaijan and the Caspian Sea, but it went too far and was defeated.
اتسعت المسافات واندحرت الحملة الألمانية.
Similarly, the U.S. cut off the oil supplies from Japan, which eventually led to the use of the atomic bomb.
مما دعا الولايات المتحدة إلى استعمال القنبلة الذرية.
ولكن يا دكتور مصطفى ولكن يا دكتور مصطفى يعني عفوا.
Dr. Mustafa, if France allows the United States to control the Middle East, then the U.S. may cut oil supplies from France and the EU.
أمريكا في يوم ما في المستقبل القريب هذا النفط عن الوصول إلى الاتحاد الأوروبي.
Some observers say that only China and the European Union can stop the United States.
بإمكانهما أن يقفا في وجه الولايات المتحدة.
يعني أنا أتفق مع حضرتك.
I agree with you. The European Union and China may benefit the least from this war.
إذا كانت حصة هناك.
If France could get a share, it would be a very small one when compared to the share of the American oil companies such as Chevron and Texaco. The Bush administration is personally linked to the oil industry. The European Union may emerge as the biggest loser. Its economy heavily relies on oil, but it does not have any oil resources. Thus, it wants to minimize its losses.
إذا كان ما تقوله صحيحا إذا فسر لي المذكرة الفرنسية.
If what you are saying is right, then why the French proposal contradicts the American proposed resolution?
القرار الأمريكي بالتأكيد.
Of course there is a contradiction, but France still leaves the door open. What France is really saying is the use of force is the last resort, and that conditions to go to war have not been met yet. I believe the French conditions will eventually be met if the Total Oil Company gets a share in the Iraqi oil. Then the French conditions for war would be met. We have to be realistic in evaluating the situation. Interests motivate politics, and thus the French national interests are the main motivation behind the French policy. As Arabs, we should not depend on France to use the veto. We do not agree with that at all.
Foreign Minister Ahmed Maher voiced hope the upcoming Arab Summit will issue decisions that could help solve the Iraq crisis peacefully. Maher made his remarks after holding talks with U.S. Ambassador to Egypt, David Welsh. Welsh said he explained Washington's view regarding a new Security Council draft resolution proposed by the U.S., Britain, and Spain. Maher also met with the French ambassador in Cairo. Chief Weapons Inspector Hans Blix said on Tuesday that Iraq has informed UN arms inspectors of the discovery of some 100 documents dealing with the disposal of weapons of mass destruction in 1991. Blix added that Iraq has also informed inspectors of the discovery of an R-400 bomb containing liquids in an area where Baghdad was known to have disposed of biological weapons in the past. Blix also said the new disclosures, which he described as positive and which need to be explored further, came in a series of 6 letters sent to his UN Monitoring, Verification and Inspection Commission on MOVIC in the past 3 days. Inspectors have been asking Iraq for evidence that it unilaterally destroyed some of the banned weapons that are unaccounted for. Anxiety over North Korea's launch of a missile into the sea between Korea and Japan was on Tuesday played down by U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell. The missile launch came on the eve of the inauguration of South Korea's new president, Roh Moo-hyun, and a ceremony attended by Powell, Japanese Prime Minister Junichiro Koizumi, and other officials. Speaking at a press conference in Seoul after Roh's inauguration ceremony, Powell tried to dispel fears over the test, saying it seemed to be a fairly innocuous kind of test that U.S. officials had heard was imminent. Powell reiterated the U.S. stance on the North Korean nuclear crisis, saying multilateral dialogue was the way to resolve the issue. But he said the U.S. was not looking at regime change in Pyongyang. Finally, UN Secretary General Kofi Annan has urged Greek and Turkish Cyprus to stick to a Friday deadline for a deal to reunify the island, saying he did not want to see the date extended by more than a few days. Annan said the decision time has arrived, as he arrived in Greece on Tuesday for talks on the long-awaited plan to end the partition of the Mediterranean islands, whose northern third was seized by Turkish troops in 1974. After meeting Turkey's governing party leader, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, Annan told reporters there was an urgency to move ahead and try and come to an acceptable solution as quickly as possible. The Greeks have repeatedly urged the UN to convince Turkey of the need to apply pressure on to the Turkish Cypriots to accept a deal. On Wednesday, Annan will meet Greek President Kostas Stefanopoulos before heading to Cyprus.
President George W. Bush, meanwhile, continued his threats both against Iraq and the UN Security Council.
We're going to work with the members of the Security Council in the days ahead to make it clear to Saddam that the demands of the world and the United Nations will be enforced. It's an interesting moment for the Security Council and the United Nations. It's a moment to determine, for this body that we hope succeeds, to determine whether or not it is going to be relevant as the world confronts the threats to the 21st century. Is it going to be a body that means what it says? We certainly hope it does. But one way or the other, Saddam Hussein, for the sake of peace and for the security of the American people, will be disarmed.
Iraq said that UN inspections had confirmed that it did not have weapons of mass destruction, while 6 nations in the crowd that hold Baghdad's fate in their hands, all members of the UN Security Council, said they wanted to give inspectors more time. Meanwhile, the Palestinian Authority warned that Israel would exploit a war in Iraq to toughen measures against the Palestinians, while the world's attention was focused on Baghdad. These statements were made at the last day of the Non-Aligned Movement Summit held in Kuala Lumpur.
The floor in the non-aligned movement conference was given today to Iraq and Palestine, the main two countries under plight due to aggressions from the United States and its allies, which are being toughly condemned by their conferees. Iraqi Vice President Taha Yassin Ramadan told NAM's 116 members gathering in Kuala Lumpur that Iraq is determined to continue the serious and professional work to facilitate the investigation to any issue that the inspectors need, while denouncing the United States for trying to dominate the world.
The Iraqi strong will and the full cooperation with the inspectors have revealed the false claims of the United States. The true intentions of the U.S. aggression on Iraq were revealed by U.S. Secretary of State when he said that the main aim of the war is to occupy Iraq and to redraw the geopolitical map of the Middle East and to reensure better conditions to the Zionist entity.
Palestinian Chairman Yasser Arafat, who spoke from his West Bank headquarters in Ramallah by a video link, stated that a succession of peace initiatives had foundered because of Israeli neglect and contempt, and that he feared the world's attention would focus on Iraq and ignore the plight of the Palestinians.
The Palestinian people who are suffering the greatest hardships as a result of the Israeli aggression and the occupation of their land and properties are going to pay a heavy price if this war is waged, as the Israeli government is the first in line to push for such a war in order to exploit the situation here while the world is busy with Iraq.
Arafat told the assembly that the international community must bring an end to this with the implementation of international law confiscated by the U.S., which Cuba's President Fidel Castro lambasted for trying to coerce the world into supporting an attack on Iraq.
Authority is snatched from the United Nations, its established procedures obstructed, and the organization itself destroyed. Development assistance is reduced. There are continuous demands from the third world countries to pay a $2.5 trillion debt that cannot be paid under the present circumstances, while $1 trillion are spent in over more sophisticated and deadly weapons. Why is that? What is that for?
This summit, which is due to end later today, will issue a special statement which will condemn any attack on Iraq without United Nations support, while urging Baghdad to actively cooperate with UN weapons inspectors.
Hezbollah Secretary General Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah stressed the nation must bear its responsibilities in a ceremony during which he placed the cornerstone of a cultural and religious complex in southern suburbs of Beirut. Sayyid Nasrallah said that the United States is treading over the international public opinion and the views of governments opposing its war on Iraq, wondering why the Arabs are not playing their role in defending their peoples and nations.
ضمن انعدام روح المسؤولية أيضا أنه إحنا نطلع على مستوى المنطقة ونشوف كل شيء عم بيصير بالمنطقة نحن شو بنخصها، شو بيعنينا، وحتى إذا بتحكي بيقولوا لك أنت شو لك عليها. أصبح من الجرائم في هذا الزمن أن يتحدث الإنسان عن هموم الأمة. أنك تحكي فلسطين يعني والشهداء الذين يسقطون كل يوم في فلسطين، وتطالب الأمة بموقف جدي وبموقف صارم اتجاه هذه الأخطار وهذه التحديات. يا أخي أنت شو لك على موضوع فلسطين؟ ويأتي من الفلسطينيين من يقول لك ذلك، ويأتي من العرب من يقول لك ذلك. أمريكا التي تقول أنها تأتي إلى المنطقة لتعلم حكام المنطقة كيف يحترمون شعوبهم وكيف يحترمون آراء شعوبهم، هي تدوس بجزمات العسكر وبجنازير الدبابات على عقول وقلوب وآراء شعوب العالم. الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية تريد أن تنقذ الشعب العراقي من صدام، ولكن ما هي الصورة التي تريد أن تنقذ بها الشعب العراقي من صدام؟ هي أن تقتله، هي أن تدمره، هي أن تقتل مئات الآلاف ومئات والملايين من أبناء الشعب العراقي.
His Majesty the King has held talks with British Prime Minister Tony Blair on the Iraq issue and developments in the Palestinian territories. The talks, which took place after the King arrived in London on a brief visit, also dealt with Anglo-Jordanian ties. During the talks, King Abdullah emphasized the need to give a last chance to peace, to avert war against Iraq and save the region from further catastrophe and destruction. King Abdullah and Blair said they were for a peaceful solution to the standoff through Iraq's disarmament and urged Baghdad to display more cooperation with UN weapons inspectors, implement UN Resolution 1441, and not waste this last opportunity. A day after the United States and allies proposed a UN resolution opening the way for war on Iraq, U.S. President George W. Bush said approval was not essential, and only Iraq could avert war and conflict by fully disarming. He said Iraqi President Saddam Hussein had failed to meet UN disarmament demands. Bush underscored the U.S. position that it would go to war with or without new Security Council action if Iraq does not disarm. He said he hoped for approval of the resolution introduced by the United States, Britain, and Spain. British Prime Minister Tony Blair continued a hectic round of diplomacy after the new resolution was tabled.
Obviously, we'd like to have a positive vote. That's why we've submitted a Security Council resolution along with Great Britain and Spain. But as I said all along, it would be helpful and useful, but I don't believe we need a second resolution.
To those who say we are rushing to war, I say this: we are now 12 years after Saddam was first told by the UN to disarm, nearly 6 months after President Bush made his speech to the UN accepting the UN route to disarmament, nearly 4 months on from Resolution 1441, and even now today, we are offering Saddam the prospect of voluntary disarmament through the UN.
Israeli occupation army left destruction in the infrastructure of Beit Hanun this dawn, in addition to destroying houses, streets, farms, and schools before withdrawing from the town. BBC reporters said that occupation forces completely destroyed 10 houses and turned them into ruins. The Israeli army destroyed hundreds of dunams and greenhouses, where financial damages reached millions of dollars. In Bethlehem Governorate, Israeli forces broke this morning into Artas village, then undertook a campaign of searching and storming houses. They also arrested 5 citizens and assaulted others and caused destruction to citizens' properties. In Qalqilia Governorate, occupation forces imposed a night curfew on Azzoun town from 4 p.m. until 6 a.m., while curfew is still imposed on Al-Fundaq village east of Qalqilia for the second day running, leading to closing schools and disturbing citizens' daily life. Israeli forces demolished this dawn 4 houses at a Tufah road block west of Khan Yunis city. The General Security Directorate said that a number of Israeli military vehicles demolished 4 residential buildings, 3 of them belonging to Abu Ubaid family, while the 4th belongs to Abu Daqqa family. Families of detainees held today their weekly sit-in strike in front of the premises of the International Red Cross in Gaza in solidarity with their sons inside the Israeli prisons. Condolences were received in the premises for the martyr Riyad Abu Zaid and the detainee Walid Abu Amru, who recently died at Nafha prison for lack of medical care. Representatives of national and Islamic powers took part in the strike, calling on the international community and human institutions to intervene for halting the inhumane measures practiced by Israeli occupation forces against the Palestinian people and political prisoners inside the Israeli jails.
Mosaic is made possible by a grant from the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, which promotes journalism excellence worldwide and invests in the vitality of 26 U.S. communities, and the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. Additional support provided by Henry and Virgilia Dakin.